and we are live.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. All right, now this commences our Wednesday, September 16, 2020 ACC Community Police Advisory Board Development Task Force meeting. And to begin, I would ask, has everyone had a chance to read over the minutes from our Wednesday, September the 9th, 2020 meeting?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you, Phil. All right, are there any changes and amendments that needs to be made to those minutes, as anyone sees? Okay, so if I could, please, would someone make a motion to adopt and accept those minutes from that meeting?
So moved.
I second.
Okay, the motion been made and seconded. All in favor say aye.
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 Okay, all opposed say nay. Okay, the ayes have it. Let the record reflect that the minutes from the Wednesday, September 9th, 2020 meeting has been adopted. Okay, and going on to the order of business today, has everyone had a chance to look over the agenda for today?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, are there any amendments, addition, or retractions that anyone suggests be made from the agenda today? Okay, all right, and can I have a motion to accept today's agenda as the agenda?
So moved.
Okay, can I have a second of that motion?
Yes, Joan.
Okay, all right, the motion has been made that we adopt today's agenda as written. All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed say nay. Okay, the ayes have it. Let the record reflect that we have adopted the agenda as written, and okay, and on to B. Today we're going to discuss. Okay, did you say something, Phil?
No.
Okay.
Nope, not at all.
Okay, just make sure I didn't lose my connection. Okay, today I guess we'll get down into the meat and bones of the model that we have selected. And Leon, I suspect that there'll be a lot of questions posed to you for your expertise and experience, so that we can know what this is going to look like going forward, know what we can expect, and also know what not to expect of it. And the first is item B on the agenda, and that is duties and scope. We want to clearly identify the objective and the scope of the proposed agency. And I think this is something that we may have been hashing over for a while, but Liana, if you could maybe give us a bullet point of the objective and purpose, so that we can make sure that we are in line with the correct expectations of it.
So thank you. Thank you for asking me to attend again. I hope I can be helpful. I hope I did send you a couple of things after the last meeting that Sarah forwarded on to you. I believe when we spoke, we were talking a little bit about Madison and Madison, Wisconsin, and what they were doing in Alexandria, Virginia. I wanted to send you those, not to overwhelm you, but to at least give you an idea of what other communities are looking at as far as putting in with respect to, more the type of authority that they're giving the oversight agencies. So I believe that, the bullet points that you have here are very appropriate with respect to, will the model accept complaints? Do you want me to go through each of the bullet points and comment on them if you think that would be helpful, or how would you like me to approach it?
Yes, ma'am. I think that would be most helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so accepting the complaints, I think that's actually a very important point. I was just reading a proposed model from one of the other another community, all of them that I work with, and this was something in it. It's actually a model that's been in existence for a while, and they're looking to revamp it. And one of the pushbacks, or one of the concerns that they've gotten from the community is they do have kind of like an auditor model, but they don't have the ability to accept complaints. Whereas the community knows very well that the complaints are still investigated by the law enforcement agency there. They still feel that it is important that the auditor, the officer, that individual has the ability to accept the complaints. So I think it's a kind of a show of transparency with the community and basically that accessibility to the complaint process. And sometimes individuals, are reluctant to go and file a complaint directly with the police department. So that's one of the things that you want to be able to make that process as open and inviting, if I could use that word, as possible with respect to being able to take complaints. And so, of course, if you're not going to give the authority to investigate for the model to do their own investigations, that will be something that, you'll need to make clear that, especially with the complainants, that, the expectation isn't there that the model will be or the auditor would be the one to conduct investigations, that it would still go over to the law enforcement agency to do that. And I know you guys haven't completely decided on that altogether, but I think it is important either way for the model to actually be able to accept complaints. We talked a little bit last time too, as far as the types of complaints. And I think I shared with you that, in some communities, some of the models kind of triage the complaints as far as, depending on the severity maybe of the complaint, like the use of force complaints or racial bias complaints. It depends on the number of complaints that you're going to get, and will you be able to handle, when I say handle, so you won't be overwhelmed given how you staff the oversight model, will you be able to have the capacity to review and process those complaints in a timely manner. I will tell you that it's really some of the larger agencies that kind of triage, if you will, the complaints. But for the most part, the majority of the oversight agencies will take the complaints. I mean, when I say will take the complaints, they're not going to say, well, we're only going to take this type of complaint and not another. They're pretty much open to taking all complaints. So the other part of that is also anonymous complaints, because that's going to come up too, whether your agency will accept anonymous complaints. And you have to kind of give a lot of thought to that. I think anonymous complaints should be taken to the extent that you can actually investigate them, because regardless of whether you're going to be the investigative piece, the oversight agency is, or the law enforcement agency, anonymous complaints can be difficult to investigate because you don't have anybody to follow up with. You may only be able to get so far in the investigation. But I believe sometimes anonymous complaints need to be evaluated very carefully to see if, okay, do we really need this additional, do we really need to contact this person to be able to go with this complaint? Do we have the leads, so to speak, to be able to investigate this complaint? And is it an issue of, community concern, or even, the government or the law enforcement agency's concern that if this complaint is, proven, is this something of a nature that needs to be addressed? So there are some agencies that don't accept anonymous complaints, but I think that is kind of changing a little bit, recognizing here again people's reluctance sometimes to be the complainant when they observe something that can be critical or crucial to either one individual or a practice that they see that is inappropriate. So I think you're going to want to consider that as part of, in that complaint process as well. I know that this part, as far as investigating the complaints or reviewing them, I know we didn't get that far last week, but I guess that's a decision that you will still have to make. Remember, we talked about if you do your own investigations, your model is going to have to be more of the auditor investigator model with investigative authority and the ability to, have those that level of experience to conduct investigations, but you're also going to have to give the model or the office the ability to access the information that they need to be able to do the investigations. And when I say the information they need, the majority of the information is going to come from not just, the interviews of witnesses or officers. It's going to also come from, the having access to the body-worn camera, the radio transmissions, any other media that's available, pictures, police reports, the dispatch records, all of that stuff. If you create it with respect to giving them investigative authority, you're going to need to write in that availability to have access to all of those, all of the potential evidence to conduct the investigation. I think the bullet on, making both disciplinary and policy training recommendations, we haven't really gotten that far into that, that conversation. I think given the structure that you have, the auditor should look at, or whatever the oversight, whatever you land on, should have the ability to look at the discipline to see if it's consistent. In other words, does the discipline meet the the severity of the violation, and is it consistent across the board? Is it consistently being meted out based on the level of violation? I don't believe, and I haven't studied your city charter, but I would assume that the discipline still remains in the hands of the chief of police, and ultimately probably this, either the city manager or the mayor, depending on your, civil service, your structure with respect to discipline of employees. I believe the agency should have the ability to make recommendations on policy and training, because sometimes, especially if you're looking at all the complaints, you're going to be able to see, any kind of patterns and trends coming up that you may want to make recommendations or ask for presentations on, how are you training the officers to respond to mental health calls, or homeless individuals, or, different kinds of, crisis types of calls. So I believe that you should not only have access to the type of training, but be able to make recommendations to the training policies and training as they come up. The final that bullet about the decision maker for the complaint disposition. I mean, I think that's still probably under an audit model that usually still falls within, the chief of police's venue. The auditor can still disagree. I think we talked about this last time. I mean, you can disagree with the finding, and in most structures, then the final decision maker then it's usually elevated up to the level. In your case, it would probably be to the city manager's level, or to the mayor's office, because you can basically agree to disagree, but it still needs to be resolved, right? So if you feel strongly about the position or the outcome that the oversight entity is coming to, I think you're going to have to make the decision maker either your city manager or your mayor. And the same with the next bullet, as far as any kind of disagreements between the agency and the police department. I would assume that the head of the oversight agency is probably going to be appointed by the city manager. If not appointed by the city manager, or confirmed by your elected officials. And I know Sherry and Blaine are on the call, so maybe they can weigh in this conversation when you get to this. And I think the public reporting requirements is very important. You should write that into your requirements as far as what the office will do, because talking about that transparency and accountability, your community, the oversight model is going to be accountable also to the community. They're going to want to see the work that how many complaints are they taking, how many outreach engagements did they do, with whom, what were their recommendations, how many complaints did they review, how many complaints did they agree with, how many did they not agree with, what recommendations were made, because the agency also needs to be accountable to the community. So most agencies do either twice a year reporting. Some just do, once a year. I think in the first year of existence, it's usually good to do maybe, twice a year, like after 6 months, because you would be, staffing up and getting all the processes in place. And I think that would be important for the community to know all those, the steps that have been taken. And then what kind of outreach efforts have occurred. So I think that reporting requirement is going to be important that you incorporate into the requirements for the office, so to speak. So do you want me to stop here and go over questions? Because I kind of went through those kind of quickly.
Yeah, I wanted to Mocha.
Hi, Mocha.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I definitely wanted the group to be able to ask you questions. Some of us had time to think about what we would want to see, and I wanted to also hear from them what they would want to see and be able to ask you any questions and what is the model in Arizona doing when it comes to some of these things.
I had a question, Liana. This is Joan. I was, of course, thinking about this in the context of intimate partner violence, which is my field. And so thinking about confidentiality, you touched on anonymous complaints, which I think do need to be allowed. But I'm thinking about safety issues. If someone were to make a complaint, say about a non-arrest situation or something like that, and I looked at the materials, Alexandria and Madison, about the confidentiality of information, and saw some specific references to things like maybe employment type information. But I'm just wondering if you have any familiarity with cities that have had to balance perhaps a safety issue, where, say, an abuser is trying to find what a victim has made a complaint about, for example, and use that, or has that not specifically come up?
I don't think it's
a conflict between the transparency and potentially
right.
when we're talking about IPV issues.
So I don't personally. I haven't. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my feedback a little bit. I haven't really seen that come up. I know in Arizona, just because of our public records laws, a lot of that information is public record, but it is redacted, highly redacted. So like you said, addresses, phone numbers, personal, that type of information. We also have very strong victims' rights bills in Arizona too. So there are additional things based on the type of complaint and the type of investigation that would be redacted. But I haven't really seen that specifically written into the ordinances for the oversight agency. I think it's more so that the law enforcement agency because they would be the keeper of the records. So because the actual complaints are going to them and they are, doing the actual investigation. So they would actually be following whatever state law there is with respect to releasing information. I don't know if Sherry has a different take on that, but I would think all that information would be redacted and not disclosed.
If I can, I'd like to kind of lend some ideas or suggestions of how it's worked when I've done this before. I know in Alexandria, when we were reporting to the board or when we were sitting down with an auditor, we would include the names of the victims, of the witnesses, of all of the people in there. But when we gave our written report and when they were presenting information publicly, we would use demographic information, but we wouldn't say the name. So we'd say a white male police officer, a Asian male victim, and we wouldn't be specific about naming people publicly. In many instances, people would know who those people are because they might be aware of the case, and social media wasn't as great a problem then as it is now. But I think that the answer to your question is that the auditor or monitor behind closed doors would have access to all of it, names and everything. But publicly, we would clean it up to the point where you would know the demographics and nothing beyond that, and that would address the confidentiality piece.
If I can jump in really quickly. I just want to make sure it's really clear that when this group would be subject to the Open Records Act and all of its requirements, and there's no additional safeguards that you would be able to impose that don't already apply under that act. So, I certainly could talk about specific types of records that might be more vulnerable to release, but there is no like exception that says victims' names can't be released. I mean, that just, there's arguably one for rape, but there isn't for really anything else, including children. So this group would want to think very carefully about any documents that they have, including emails, because those would all be subject to release. And I'm not saying obviously we don't want to disclose things, but I'm just saying we want to be really careful with sensitive information.
Right. So it's just it's one piece of this that I just want to put out there, the balance between the transparency and the sunshine laws that have to be abided by, but also what that would mean, particularly for survivors of domestic violence and any interactions that they might have with this kind of group, and that would be very clear once it's established what the limits and parameters are.
I have a follow-up question that's kind of to that point as well. Excuse me. This is Stephanie Flores. My question is if you have any experience with some of these advisory committees informing policy change at like a local level. So for example, in this instance, it's really unfortunate that we only have protections for victims in cases of rape, because there's so many other instances where people's privacy or people's safety are at risk that are not just rape. That we don't have one for children is really interesting to me as well. And so has there ever been an advisory board that through their investigations have found that we had some updated policy and informed that policy, like got with the mayor and commission and we're like, this is a policy that we want to implement countywide that will help safeguard people?
And if I could jump in and speak to that, and I realize I think that was directed to Leanna. The problem is that this is state law. Right. It's not something that we can pass an ordinance and say, we think that we need to protect children who are victims of crime. And I do want to be clear, there are exceptions related to children when it comes to sex crimes, children that are in DFACS care. There's a whole gamut of things that relate to children. But at the base level, for instance, say someone steals a kid's bike, it's a silly example, and the child calls the police. That child's name is not going to be redacted in a theft report. So we could talk about it more specifically, but there's just no way that we can change the state law on that, because the presumption is that government records should be released because of freedom of information. And so that presumption is going to trump anything we might want to do locally.
And that was going to be my response, that I'm not aware of any boards being able to influence policy, because it's really more legislative policy that they would have to, and they don't get involved in that. That would be, something that would be need to be taken up at the state level to change state law.
I have a quick question. Leanna, thank you again for being with us. In our last meeting, we had basically started gravitating towards the auditor monitor focus model hybrid with review focus model, which I believe is what you have in Tucson. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I thought it might be helpful, looking at the questions that we were just grappling with, to ask the same questions as it relates directly to Tucson. So my question, particularly the first couple of questions, does the Tucson agency accept complaints of police misconduct?
Yes.
Okay. And what types of complaints does Tucson accept, and from whom?
All of them. So it can be a rudeness, an attitude, a use of force, disparate treatment, racial. They get categorized into different levels of, either is this a service level, is this a training issue, or the types get categorized, but none are really turned away. Sometimes the complaints are more looked at as, okay, there's a rule for that, or there's a policy for that. And so it's kind of a quick answer to the type of complaint. We do take anonymous complaints, but they are those are the ones that are kind of triaged based on, is the information that we have enough to go on? Because sometimes it's not. And if it's not, it just has to be closed out. But yes, they do take anonymous complaints as well.
So in a sense, I guess you don't really necessarily completely replicate what had been done in-house in the police department. Is there some sort of trigger mechanisms that you decide what complaints you accept and what don't, or what's the threshold, I guess? How you decide the threshold?
So the TPD, Tucson Police Department, their level of, accepting complaints is the same. They'll take everything.
Okay,
as well.
all right.
They will take everything as well. So that the question becomes, so what happens is the complaints, by setting it up that the auditor can take complaints as well. Some citizens, or members of the community rather, will go directly to the police department, which is fine. They're filing the complaints over there, or they're filing the complaints directly with the auditor. When they file them directly with the auditor, they are turned over to the police department to actually conduct the investigation. But the auditor has access to both levels. In other words, not just the ones that came through the auditor's door, but the ones that came directly to the police department as well, because you want the whole picture, not just what's coming directly to the auditor.
Okay. And I was kind of confusing my third question, which is, does the agency in Tucson investigate the complaints?
No, they don't have investigative authority. They do have the authority to monitor the ongoing investigation. So what we would do is, if it was a use of force or more of a serious type of allegation, we would elect to monitor that investigation. In other words, we could sit in when the internal affairs was interviewing witnesses or interviewing the officers, and we could be able to ensure that our questions were also being asked. Even though we weren't conducting the investigation, it was easier for us to ask those questions at the time the investigation was occurring than waiting for it to be closed and then review it and say, oh, you didn't interview this witness. We want this witness interview. And then they have to reopen the investigation and go back and bring that individual in. It's very helpful, especially for, high profile types of complaints or very serious complaints.
Thank you. That is very helpful, because I was getting a little bit confused, because when we first started talking about accepting all complaints, I thought we might be dipping a little bit more into the investigation focused model, but there's definitely a clear difference between you can still accept all complaints without routinely conducting investigations.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was probably my biggest question of all. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else with questions?
While we're waiting for a pause or waiting for the next person, can I ask Linda, is there, because you said that in Tucson, they accept all complaints. And so anyone could come in and make that complaint. But I'm just trying to, it doesn't turn into a formal complaint until after you've looked at it to see whether there's a quick answer that you can give the person, whether it's a policy issue, or whether there's a need for an actual investigation or not. Is there something that delineates how that works? Because more often than not, what happens with the police department is that, a person will come in and they'll say, I didn't like the way that this happened or something that happened. And we'll sit down and say, well, what is it that was of concern? If they say, I didn't think that I was speeding and I shouldn't have got a speeding ticket, then that's not something that we would file a formal complaint off of. We would tell them to go to court to address that. So certain things wouldn't automatically result in a formal complaint unless there was an alleged violation of departmental policy. I don't know whether that's the way it is in Tucson or that's the way we want to go forward here, but I think that's the way that I would recommend.
Correct, Chief. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I should have made it with respect to if somebody calls and says, I got a parking ticket or I got a speeding, there's another venue for that. That's, if that's what your complaint is, you need to go to court for that. If your complaint is, I got a speeding ticket and in the course of giving me the ticket, the officer, cursed me out, whatever. That's a different issue. We would look at that, but the issue with respect to the citation would need to be addressed through court. And then also, as you said, if sometimes if it's a question of a policy or, can the officer, here we used to get a lot of complaints about, officers, our motors officers, the ones on motorcycles could, in Arizona, it's legal, but, and even for the law enforcement to actually, cut the line, or what do they call it? Split the lanes. To get to the front of the intersection, because that's how they're trained, and it's legal in Arizona for them to do that. And we get a lot of complaints about that. But it's like that's how they're trained, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. So sometimes we can explain things, but as the auditor, we don't like to, be the ones, explaining. I mean, if it's something that's straightforward and cut and dry, and there's a policy on that, and they were within policy. But for the most part, if it's more of a complex type of a complaint, obviously there's going to need to be an investigation. But yes, definitely anything with pending charges. Sometimes we advise individuals that the charges, and this is where it gets kind of tricky sometimes too, if you can't separate the charges from the actual allegation of misconduct, sometimes we recommend that they wait till their charges are adjudicated to then pursue the misconduct piece, so that it doesn't like blur the lines or affect their criminal, the criminal case in any ways. But those are things that you can set up kind of with your policies and procedures as you establish the operations of the office.
Okay. I don't think, TK, do you have any questions? I'm going to make sure that everybody get their turn to speak and to be able to.
I don't really have any questions right now. I've really just been listening. Sorry for my dog. I've just been listening, and I don't really have any questions.
I have one question. In Tucson, is there a statute of limitations on complaints?
That's a good question. So it's usually 6 months, 180 days, because after that, it's really hard to do a thorough, any kind of a real thorough investigation. You start losing witnesses, or people's memories aren't going. So yes, it's 180 days to file a complaint. However, they can make an exception if it's like a very egregious type of allegation. I mean, we had a situation where there was an allegation against multiple officers for, engaging in sexual misconduct while on duty. Well, that went beyond 6 months because the witnesses that actually came forward, had information, verifiable information about instances that had happened prior to the 6 months timeline. And so it was determined that it was a serious enough allegation for us to, what we call it, told the time limit to be able to accept those complaints and take them. But yeah, you're going to want to have a starting point also, because when you start your office too, you're not going to say, okay, we're open to, accept complaints. You don't want to say you're going to take something that happened 5 years ago, or you're going to have to, create, what is the start point and what is your timeline going to be? And usually what we see is 6 months, that 180 days is pretty much the kind of the rule of thumb for most agencies.
And are the exceptions made also for when cases have to when people have to finish their legal proceedings before filing a complaint?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anyone else? If TK or Markeisha or anyone else have any questions, we'll move on to C on the agenda, item number C. All right, Leanne, could you discuss with us the importance of independence and how to ensure that? Is that based on the ordinance language? What can we do to make sure that this entity is independent? Because that is something that has come up more than once, even in the surveys that we have taken.
Yeah, I think that's going to be important for you're gaining the legitimacy within the community, as far as how you ensure that independence, so the community doesn't feel that the office is being run by others than the person that you put into the position. So I mean, I think one of the ways is obviously maybe some of the language in the ordinance, can address that. I think it's going to depend kind of depoliticize it, if you will. If the person is, basically appointed by the city manager and not the elected officials. I mean, and I'm not saying anything negative about your elected officials, but sometimes if it's looked as though the elected officials are making that decision, then it looks like it kind of politicizes, the appointment. Obviously, they can be part of the confirming the appointment of the person, but ultimately the individual should be reporting to probably, the person who handles the management of the city on a day-to-day basis. I know that, there are very, very few agencies out there. I can only name one or two, like Detroit, their board of police commissioners are elected, and they're probably the only ones in the country that, they actually elect them to their board. But for the most part, they are appointed. I think it's going to just have to be how you write it into the language. I used to say that, my title said independent police auditor, which meant I was independent. I could make you can't, terminate me for making independent decisions or recommendations. But I know that wasn't enough to hang my hat on. So I think it's going to be something that you're going to have to work on with respect to how you word it in the language. And then, of course, it's going to also be demonstrated by the person in the position as far as, are they able to, make, the reporting requirements so that they're not censored. When I say censored, as far as, what kind of information are they going to be able to put out there? It's going to be a kind of, one of the bigger hurdles with respect to gaining the legitimacy of independence within the community.
Okay. Did anyone want to chime in? All right, so item number D. So I was reading some of the documentation that came over, and it was referring to the difference of having some of this language either written into the municipal charter versus the ordinance. And I know the attorney's on here too. So I would like to get your feedback on that. So you guys have an ordinance as opposed
Right.
to
Tucson's is by ordinance. And I'm sure Sherry has it. So if you do it by charter, that means it has to be by vote, by mandate. Brought in by your electorate of your community. I will tell you that there have been some oversight agencies that were by ordinance, and then it was very easy to take things away from them or not give them the authority or things that they needed. So they had determined to go back. So Denver and Oakland went back and did it by voter mandate to get their level of authority in there. So did San Francisco. In Tucson, it's worked for us, but that's not to say there could be something that wouldn't work, because it's easier to change an ordinance because that's something that your elected officials can do just by vote. It's harder to change a charter because then you have to have an election, to do that. But I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at what how that process would work there in Georgia.
I have a question for Blaine or Sherry. How are the other major commissions set up here for Athens-Clarke County?
Well, the other major, sorry, I've got some feedback.
Here, I'll mute myself again.
Okay, thank you, Joan. So the major commissions, if you will, I think has established an ordinance, Sherry, and I think that would include the Greenways Commission and the Cultural Affairs Commission. And they're really different in the nature. They're advisory boards. They're appointed by the mayor and commission. They do have in ordinance, Liana, sort of what their charge is and the things that they're responsible for. And that's helpful because we refer to that often and they do too. They have a staff liaison that works within the manager form of government, and we try to dutifully take their any recommendations they have to the mayor and commission. I think we try to note minority opinion, and certainly staff has the opportunity to say where they stand, but all of that gets reported. So that's how those work. I don't know if it's a direct analogy to this.
most of the oversight agencies are working by ordinance, and again, it depends on what you put at what the elected officials put into the authority that you're giving, the office, and if you articulate that specifically, what their role and levels of authority are in your ordinance, you shouldn't really have, an issue. As I say, the majority are. Denver and Oakland and San Francisco as examples, because there were additional things that they wanted to be doing, and they wanted to make sure it wasn't taken away from them by ordinance.
And was that by the voter by mandate? That's the part I'm concerned about.
Yes, they did it by voter mandate.
So it would have to be written in the language, because once it's established, I'm concerned about maybe 2-3 years, maybe 4 years from now, new body of government comes in, it's watered down, don't have enough funded, all the things that's recommended starts to change. So how can we keep those things intact? Because it takes years to build relationships. So I just wanted, that would be written into the ordinance about voter mandate. All right. So does anyone have any questions for Leanna regarding that?
I have a question for Blaine, and it's just regarding, and actually Leanna too. Did you mention that you were the auditor for Tucson?
Yes.
Were you paid for that work, or?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess then my question for Blaine is, what is our budget? And I guess, and that would come up with us also talking about how many people are going to be on the board, and actually, yeah, how many people were you working with, Leanna?
So in Tucson, we have 900 sworn officers. Our police force is substantially larger than yours. But when I first started in 1997, it was myself and a staff of one other support staff. But the information was also, or the level of authority that the auditor had was a little more limited at that point. So it was doable. About 2 years and I'm giving you this as an analogy with respect to, resources. About 2 years into my position, my city manager at the time asked if I could also take over the city's EOO office. And so, of course, it would have been political suicide for me to say, oh, no, I can't do that, when that was when there was a bunch of budget cuts going on, and I didn't want the police auditor piece to go away. So we combined the offices, and in combining the offices, I got the ability to have additional staff. So I had staff to do complaint intakes, and I had staff to do just outreach. So at one time, to answer your question, I had a staff of 16 people, but they were all doing different things, not all the audit stuff. I would say that the majority, you could probably have done all the police audit stuff with 3 individuals at that time. And right now, the office is only being staffed by 1 individual, because after I left, they took more budget cuts and separated things out. And the full disclosure here, the city of Tucson is actually looking at revamping the office, the level of authority, and giving him additional resources, because not only is he looking, when I say he, the current auditor, not only is he looking at just the complaints that are coming from, the community, those complaints, but they're also looking at internal investigations as well. They sit in on all the use of force review boards and a lot of other things that have occurred. There's a lot of outreach that's going on, and it's too much for one person. So I think they're going to be recommending that it would be they would at least have the ability to use like a data analyst from either full-time or another department to basically look at the data that they're collecting with respect to, the numbers and the, types of complaints, and, and also maybe getting another individual to help with the community outreach. So sorry, that's a long way around your answer, but just kind of giving you an idea of how things kind of change depending on, the role kind of expanded. It can't be done with one person right now here in Tucson. But again, we have 900 officers. We look at about 2,000 complaints a year, and that's just the external ones.
So Leanna, I think Tucson's probably about 4 times as big as we are in Clarke County. Is the size of your city, is that the reason? Because even though you're 4 times bigger than us, you're still not quite big enough to afford the investigative model? Was that the main reason, you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to answer Stephanie's questions, make sure. Stephanie, did you get your questions answered, or did you want me to respond to anything?
Well, thank you, Leanna, for those answers. That was very thorough, and it painted a really good picture for me. But yeah, Blaine, I wanted to talk more about what our current budget was for this board in the coming year.
Okay. I would have to go look at what that budget is. I think the mayor wanted to start off with just forming this group to give us advice, and depending on the model and whatever the mayor and commission selected, once you guys come up with something, we can project what a reasonable budget would be, and the commission, of course, can just amend the budget when it enacts this body and give it the appropriate amount of funds. I will point out that if there is a monitor auditor, the commission could create a new position. We've got a lot of vacancies in the police department now. We could reallocate a position for that. So I feel confident that whatever the model is, and to Phil's point, this is a lot of the cities that are peer cities with this model are much, much larger than we are. And so when you have somebody with working 40, 50 hours a week on this, I think we could probably start with one person and see how it goes. If they get overwhelmed, and we certainly go back to the mayor and commission and get additional folks in support. And I think, Chief, I think that, you got some community outreach folks, and, we can use sort of a force multiplier in getting the word out with some existing employees, but the auditor would be have some independence, I would think, would not work for the chief.
Blaine,
Yeah, I would say the independence portion would be very important. Sorry, Chief, to cut you off, but last week we did, to be clear, last week we voted on the auditor monitor model with a sprinkle, as we said, of the review portion added to it. So that is what, the main focus is for right now. We're trying to build up the content for that. But go ahead, Chief.
I was just going to add, so certainly, we want to sit down and look at whether we can find through some of our vacancy savings positions if that's necessary, but also I recently put in for some grant funding for some additional part-time positions, just additional folks that we could push towards helping with data collection and whatever tasks need to be accomplished related to the advisory board. So we are thinking about how we're going to do the work that needs to be done.
Okay. And Leanna, could you give us a ballpark? What do you think as far as startup budget that you would recommend, and at least that for Athens size, based on the work that you have done in your expertise?
Well, the majority of the budget is really going to be the salary, and I don't know what the position of the auditor was kind of in line with not a complete department director level here, because we have a water director, we have a parks director. So those are pretty high salaries, but it was more in line with maybe like what an assistant director level salary would be. So I don't know where your salaries structure lies, but there is, the majority of the work is the staffing piece, other than the resources of, are you going to establish a separate office? Are you going to need, the equipment, the hardware pieces, are you going to need, computer equipment? Are you going to need software? What kind of software? A lot of oversight agencies use there's a couple more on the market now, but IA Pro, it's a way of actually tracking complaints and complaint outcomes so that it makes it easier to pull the data on the other side. So, there are some software solutions out there that can maybe lessen the need for having a full-time staff person doing it, because if you're entering the information into the software, it's accumulating it. So the biggest chunk will be, what that salary level person would be. I think the auditor here right now, only because he's new, I think the level the salary rate is from like $70,000 to $85,000 annually, I think. So it's commensurate with like a deputy director position. And then the other costs are really, because I mean, outreach, it doesn't really cost you much to do the outreach unless you're printing materials and brochures. I mean, I would say that you would need a budget to be able to, like, if you want to create like some kind of pamphlets that you want to be able to have as part of your outreach to distribute, you know, in the public. I mean, they do them here at public libraries, in advocacy places, you know, at the city hall. But the majority of the work is your bodies, so to speak, the individual, the salary that you put associated to the individual.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we can move on to item number E. So we stay on track. It's 3:56, I believe. So just to reiterate, one of the investigation portion came up last week, whether we're going to include that at all or not in this model and what that would look like. And Leanna, I believe you had sent us some information on an ordinance. I was trying to go through that ordinance that you sent us, but most auditor monitors can only make recommendation and cannot compel law enforcement agencies to make any systematic changes. So for us to add some teeth or to just leave it alone, do we want to include the independent investigative authority? And what is your feedback on that, Leanna, based on the ordinance that you were working on or saw come across the table a few weeks ago?
Right. And what I sent you was the ordinance that Madison had adopted, because they did give their auditor the ability to have an investigative authority. They haven't staffed that up yet. Obviously, they're still in that process. Their board is actually going to be the ones that are going to hire the auditor. But under that model, if you're going to give investigative authority, then you're going to need probably more resources. You're going to need investigators. So you may need more staff. The idea of the auditor model is that, you know, the law enforcement agency, which is already staffed to do the investigations, are doing the investigation, but that the auditor has the ability to question that investigation. In other words, either sit in and monitor, like I described earlier, to be sure that, you know, your questions are being answered, or to send an investigation back for further work if they don't feel that it was adequately fair and, you know, thoroughly investigated. So if you add the investigation authority to it, you're going to need probably more staff, like an investigator staff, or your auditor is going to have investigative, you know, true investigative background. And then you're also going to have to figure out how to do your investigations. How are you going to get access to all the other information that you're going to need? Like I said earlier, you know, the body-worn camera, the radio transcriptions, you know, all that stuff, which obviously the police department is going to have, but there's going to have to be a mechanism to, you know, get that transfer of information. So, I mean, you could still examine patterns and trends and practices and make policy recommendations without doing the investigations, because you're reviewing everything in the investigation. You're just not doing it. I don't know if that answers your question, but if you go the investigative model, you are probably going to need more resources to be able to do that.
And point of clarification, when we say Madison, we're not talking next door neighbor, Madison, Georgia here. We're talking about Madison, Wisconsin, which is more than double our size.
Correct.
And then I wanted to say this, when I want to hear everybody's feedback and opinions on this. Well, the investigative model, I don't necessarily think that the board should be doing any investigation, but as far as being a part of the process and having access to the information, that's what I would like to see. So I want to be careful with the language that we use. So the ability to examine patterns or trends in police practices and mandate for policy changes. So that's what we would be able to do based on after, I guess, the police do their investigation. Would that be possible?
Correct. That's usually the role that the boards actually take. And I could send you the board that we have here in Tucson, I can send you the information about, well, it's basically the ordinance that established them and gave them their authority. And basically it specifically covers the ability to review, the investigations and question the investigations after they've been completed.
Okay, so that's what I was, that's what we would be voting on, if everybody is okay with that. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask Miss Leanna.
Hey, I have a question actually. This is TK. My question is, so with the board not doing the investigation, would that fall upon the police and the police investigators to kind of carry that out, and the board would just be kind of reviewing and monitoring the investigation?
Yes, that's actually what an auditor model is, that the law enforcement agency, the internal affairs, would actually conduct the investigations. The auditor would be able to make the choice, if you will, of wanting to sit in on the investigations as they are occurring. And that's something you'd need to procedurally work out with the law enforcement agency if you want them to monitor the ongoing investigation, to observe the witness interviews and the interviews of the officers. But yes, the law enforcement agency is doing the investigations. Once it's completed, then the investigation and all the material that's contained, all the evidence in the investigation would be available for review by the auditor and ultimately even your board as well.
Sorry, one more thing. I know earlier you mentioned that in the city of Tucson gets about, I think you said 2,000 external complaints.
Yes.
So the board will only have purview over external complaints formed by community members, and internal things will be handled by the police, correct?
Well, it's up to you. So the city of Tucson in the actual ordinance, it doesn't really say. I mean, the reason the auditor here does the internal stuff as well is because the police chief is is very progressive and very open to that, and he wants those looked at as well. So that's why the numbers are so high, because they look at the internal stuff as well.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so I guess this is the last item on the agenda. It's Agenda E. And I would like to make a motion for us to vote. To be clear, the only investigative authority that we will have is the ability to examine patterns or trends in policing practices and mandate for policy recommendations after the police department have conducted their investigations. So the auditor would not be doing any investigation themselves. So that is what we're voting for. Can I have a motion?
Madam Chair.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is Shane. I just wanted to speak briefly before we vote on this. Is that I understand that our goal, I think most of our goal here is to call positive social change on whichever end of the line it's on. And being that we have the ability to study trends, statistics, and to be able to report back out, that does put us in a position of being able to be powerful, or the board to be powerful advocates of social change, because at the end of the day, numbers tell stories. And so, although we may not have the ability to investigate independently, we're able to see the product of those investigations, and we're able to quantify what is right and what is wrong. And it's that quantification that we can use to advocate for changes in policies on a higher level. So I just wanted to reiterate that, so that we don't feel that, we're kind of hopeless or limited in what we can do, because in reality, this does broaden the scope for what that board will be able to do.
Yes. So we can move forward?
Yes, Madam Chair. I would like to make the motion identical to what you just said.
I second that motion.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Okay, so the ayes have it. We have voted, and so that we're clear, the recommendations are going to be for the auditor to have the ability to examine patterns or trends in police practices and mandate for policy recommendations after the police department have conducted their investigation. So I think we're done. Do we have any other questions before we close out?
Yeah, I had a question, and I'm sorry, I know this has been reiterated several times over, but I didn't catch the first part of your motion when it said after the police have done their investigation, because I thought Liliana had explained that the auditors would sit in during that process and be there during the investigation. So that I questioned that why is the after part in there?
Basically, because we're not going to be doing the investigation, but the auditor monitor model already allows them to be a part of it and monitor it. So we want to be clear that the auditor is not him or her themselves doing the investigation. The police department is. So,
But when it says reviewing the materials after, but they're reviewing the materials in process, like during. From the motion that was moved, my understanding was that you had just said that, and they will review materials after the investigation is complete. But again, my understanding is that they'll be there in process. So my question was why that word after the investigation is complete is necessary.
is there a better way of restating that you think that it would be clearer, or does anybody else? Because what I'm saying in it is item number E, is the ability to examine it. Just to be clear, is that the auditor is not going to do the investigation themselves. So maybe it can be reworded that way.
Madam Chair, if I may, this is Shane. The end goal of it is to be able to examine the conclusion and to determine, that there was a fair and open investigation done. That's the end goal of that auditor. Now, in order to do that, the auditor will have the freedom to also sit in on the investigation as it occurs. So what the Madam Chair was referring to was the end game of the auditor monitor. That is to have enough knowledge and information to make a determination upon the conclusion of the police department's investigation. So it doesn't preclude how that information is gathered. That's, as she's saying, that's already written into this model itself, what we will have, or what that board will have available to them to gather the information. And so hopefully if that helps to clarify that, Amy.
If I may, I think we're actually talking about two different things. The first one is that when the investigation is ongoing, the monitor would actually be sitting either in the room or sitting in the next room looking through a mirror or watching the interview take place, and would have an opportunity to talk with investigators to say, I didn't feel like this question was asked, or can you ask this question, and play a part in that investigation. And so that's the investigative part. But the second part of it that I think Mocha's talking about is afterwards, that auditor would then be looking at the cases to see if there's patterns, whether there's trends, whether there's anything that they want us to look at how we are operating and change afterwards. So we're talking about the actual investigation and involvement or monitoring of it versus the actual investigative process afterwards to look at, is there a pattern or trend that has developed that the board wants us to address?
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Chief Sproul. I apologize to everyone for the redundancy. I think I understand when you said it that way.
Okay, and also I would reiterate, like, one of the potential weaknesses that's on the auditor monitor model is that, let me read it here. It says most auditor monitor models can only make recommendations and cannot compel law enforcement agencies to make systematic changes. So this will give us an opportunity, like if after the investigation is complete, the auditor monitor model, they're able to be a part of it, but after it's complete, they can also make recommendations on policy and different things like that. So should I reword it, or are we good?
I think we're good. I do think as we move forward that I sense from my colleagues here that that the recommendations that we make need to be super, super strong, and that we need to word this in a way that our audit findings and our recommendations are presented in a way that will be taken seriously. And I think there's ways we can noodle on this a little bit to make it that those recommendations are seen as very, very strong, and maybe address this weakness that the third item of weaknesses that the auditor monitor focus agency has.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, so do we have any other questions before we close out?
Madam Chair, I move that we adjourn.
Okay. Anyone want to second? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. All right, the ayes have it. Y'all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank y'all.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Y'all too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Liana.
Thank you. Stay dry.
We're going to try.